this episode, we start by using spaced retrieval to make Domain 2 feel like a single, coherent decision engine in your mind, rather than a set of disconnected topics you can recognize on paper but struggle to recall under pressure. Domain 2 is where the CDPSE exam leans heavily into the practical logic of privacy risk management, meaning it wants to see that you can identify risk consistently, assess it with structured thinking, choose responses that are defensible, and then prove over time that the program is working through evidence and metrics. When you are new, the hardest part is that these concepts can sound similar, because they all involve process words like evaluate, monitor, and document, and the exam often presents scenarios that mix them together. Spaced retrieval helps because it forces you to pull the key ideas out of memory and connect them in the same order you would use them in a real decision. The goal of this review is fast recall, but fast does not mean shallow. It means you can produce the right concept quickly and explain it clearly without searching for words. As you listen, focus on building mental anchors that you can attach to any scenario, because scenario questions are really tests of your ability to run the Domain 2 decision engine. By the end, you should feel that Domain 2 concepts sit in your mind as a repeatable loop of governance, assessment, response, evidence, and monitoring. The first anchor for Domain 2 is the privacy risk management process itself, because everything else is either a component of it or a supporting structure for it. You want to be able to retrieve the idea that privacy risk management is a policy-backed cycle that identifies privacy risks, assesses them consistently, selects responses, documents decisions, and monitors outcomes so the process remains alive. This matters because without a consistent process, similar activities get different answers, which creates fairness problems, compliance problems, and operational confusion. The exam expects you to connect risk management to policy, meaning policy defines triggers, roles, approvals, documentation requirements, and the organization's risk tolerance. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking risk management is a one-time exercise, but a mature program revisits decisions when data uses change, when vendors change, or when systems expand. Another misunderstanding is treating risk as only technical exposure, when privacy risk includes inappropriate use, poor transparency, unfair outcomes, and failures to honor rights. When you retrieve this anchor, also retrieve the key idea that consistency comes from defined methods and definitions, not from individual judgment. Then connect it forward, because once you have a risk process, you need assessment methods that turn uncertainty into structured outputs, which is where privacy-focused assessments enter. The next anchor is the privacy-focused assessment, often described as Privacy Impact Assessment, PIA, because it is the tool that transforms a vague concern into documented analysis and actionable controls. You should be able to recall that a PIA starts with practical scope, meaning you define what processing is being assessed, what personal information is involved, what purposes exist, what data flows occur, and what vendors or environments are included. The exam expects you to retrieve that good scoping includes not only the main system, but also analytics pipelines, logs, support tools, and vendor processing where personal information can travel. A common beginner mistake is scoping too narrowly, so the assessment misses real exposures, while another is scoping too broadly, so the assessment becomes unusable and delayed. The assessment then gathers inputs like data categories, access patterns, retention behavior, and user-facing transparency, because privacy risk is shaped by how data is collected, used, shared, and kept. The output should include identified risks tied to specific processing steps, recommended controls tied to those risks, a residual risk decision with appropriate approval, and a plan for implementation and evidence. The exam often tests whether you understand that an assessment is only valuable when its recommendations are implemented and verified, because paper analysis without follow-through is not risk management. When you retrieve the PIA anchor, connect it forward to the idea that assessment outputs feed into risk response decisions, where the organization chooses how it will handle the identified risks. Risk response is the next anchor, and the exam expects you to recall both the response options and the logic for selecting among them under real-world constraints. You want to retrieve that response includes mitigation, avoidance, transfer, and acceptance, and that the best choice depends on the nature of the harm, the sensitivity and scale of the data, the obligations in play, and the organization's defined risk tolerance. Mitigation should be recalled as targeted control changes, such as minimization, purpose limitation, access restrictions, retention enforcement, transparency updates, and vendor controls, all tied to specific risk mechanisms. Avoidance should be recalled as the responsible choice when processing cannot be made compatible with obligations or when potential harm is too high, often leading to redesign that achieves the goal with less data or less intrusive processing. Transfer should be recalled as controlled outsourcing that still requires accountability, meaning contracts and oversight can shift responsibilities but do not eliminate the organization's obligations. Acceptance should be recalled as an explicit, documented decision about residual risk with approval and monitoring, not as ignoring risk. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking the safest answer is always maximum mitigation, but the exam rewards proportionality and defensibility, meaning controls should match risk without making the process unsustainable. Another misunderstanding is treating business reality as a reason to skip controls, when mature programs balance delivery by embedding privacy early and by refining objectives to reduce unnecessary risk. When you retrieve this anchor, connect it to evidence, because response decisions must be proven through artifacts that show controls were implemented and operate. Evidence and artifacts are the next anchor, and recall here should focus on the difference between a document that exists and proof that a control works. You want to retrieve that artifacts include policies, procedures, assessments, contracts, logs, and tickets, while evidence is the subset that supports a specific claim, such as proving that access reviews occur, that rights requests are fulfilled correctly, or that vendor oversight is active. The exam expects you to think of evidence as tied to control operation over time, not just one-time documents, which means time-stamped records, consistent workflows, and protected audit trails are stronger than ad hoc notes. Evidence should support governance claims like ownership and policy enforcement, assessment claims like completion and follow-through, data lifecycle claims like inventory accuracy and retention enforcement, and operational claims like incident response discipline and rights handling quality. Vendor evidence is especially important, including due diligence records, enforceable contract terms, monitoring records, and cooperation evidence during incidents and requests. A common beginner mistake is collecting too much irrelevant documentation, which creates noise and still misses key proof, while another mistake is trying to create evidence after the fact, which reduces trustworthiness. Strong evidence is accurate, attributable, consistent, and maintainable, because evidence that requires heroics will fail during busy periods. When you retrieve evidence as an anchor, connect it forward to monitoring and metrics, because evidence is the raw material that monitoring uses to confirm controls operate and to detect drift. Monitoring and metrics are the final anchor of Domain 2, and recall here should focus on actionability, because leaders care about metrics only when they lead to decisions and improvement. You want to retrieve that monitoring is the routine verification of control operation, while metrics are the measurements that summarize performance and trends. The exam expects you to recall that privacy monitoring spans the whole program, such as assessing whether assessments occur before launch, whether inventories stay current, whether vendors remain compliant with oversight expectations, whether incidents are handled with remediation follow-through, and whether rights requests are processed within timelines with low error rates. Actionable metrics start with leader questions, like whether obligations are being met and where risk is concentrated, and they align to operational capabilities such as rights handling, incident response, vendor oversight, assessment governance, data lifecycle control, and training effectiveness. Definitions must be clear so metrics are consistent, and data quality must be strong so leaders can trust trends. Another important recall point is that metrics should include leading indicators, like completion of assessments and access reviews, not only lagging indicators like incidents, because leading indicators reveal drift early. The exam may test whether you can avoid perverse incentives, such as rewarding low incident counts, which can encourage underreporting, or rewarding speed without quality, which can create new errors. Monitoring must also have follow-through, meaning findings become remediation tasks with ownership and verification, or else monitoring becomes passive reporting. When you can retrieve this anchor, you have the end of the Domain 2 loop, and you can connect it back to risk management policy, because monitoring results often drive policy updates and process improvements. To make this spaced retrieval review useful in real exam scenarios, it helps to practice retrieving the domain 2 loop as a spoken chain that you can apply quickly to any processing change. Imagine a team wants to introduce a new analytics feature that uses personal information in a new way, and then retrieve the loop. Recognize the trigger based on policy. Scope API A to map data categories and flows. Identify risks like purpose drift and excessive retention. Choose responses like minimization and purpose controls. Document decisions and approvals. Collect evidence that controls were implemented and monitor metrics like request handling performance and incident signals over time. This practice works because it forces you to retrieve relationships, not just terms, and the exam is usually testing those relationships. Another practice method is to take a risk response, like acceptance, and retrieve what evidence and monitoring would make acceptance defensible, such as documented approvals, defined conditions, review dates, and metrics that show the risk remains stable. Beginners often practice by reading definitions, but retrieval practice is speaking the chain, because speaking reveals whether you truly understand the logic. If you can explain the chain without looking, you can handle scenario questions that hide the domain boundaries. Domain 2 is designed to be used as a system, and spaced retrieval helps you internalize it as a system rather than as separate topics. Another reason this recall matters is that domain 2 concepts often appear in questions as subtle cues rather than explicit labels, so you must recognize them by function. A question might mention a new data use and ask what should happen, and the cue is that an assessment trigger exists and a structured evaluation is needed before launch. A question might describe a vendor adding a subprocessor and ask what should be done, and the cue is that monitoring and evidence are required to detect and manage change, and risk responses may need revision. A question might describe repeated minor incidents and ask what improvement matters most, and the cue is that monitoring and metrics should reveal systemic vulnerabilities and drive remediation, training updates, or policy changes. A question might describe an organization with policies but no proof, and the cue is that evidence and artifacts are missing for control operation. The exam expects you to hear these cues and apply the domain 2 loop quickly, choosing the step that best strengthens consistency and accountability. Beginners sometimes chase the most technical answer, but domain 2 often rewards process maturity answers because privacy risk management is primarily about consistent, defensible decision systems. When you can identify the cue and map it to the right part of the loop, your answers become more accurate and faster. As we close, this spaced retrieval review is designed to make domain 2 privacy risk management and compliance logic fast to recall, because the CDPSE exam is testing whether you can apply a repeatable decision engine to real scenarios. The risk management process provides the policy-backed cycle that creates consistency. Privacy-focused assessments like PIA provide practical scope and actionable outputs, and risk response options provide the decision tools for balancing privacy protection with delivery and business reality. Evidence and artifacts provide the proof that controls were implemented and operate, and monitoring and metrics provide the feedback loop that detects drift and drives improvement leaders can act on. The strongest programs connect these elements so assessment outputs lead to responses, responses produce evidence, evidence supports monitoring, and monitoring results feed back into policy and process refinement. Spaced retrieval works because it forces you to pull the chain from memory and speak it as a coherent flow, which is exactly what exam questions require under time pressure. If you keep practicing this domain 2 loop as a spoken chain, you will find that scenario questions become less intimidating because you can quickly locate where you are in the process and choose the most defensible next step. That is the practical mastery domain 2 is designed to measure, and it is the kind of mastery that makes privacy risk management stable in the real world.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.